The Future of American Orchestras, a discussion of the problems and prospects facing American symphony orchestras, their music, and their audiences' expectations. This timely conversation examines trends and challenges facing youth, community, collegiate, and professional orchestras. In this segment, panelists discuss their vision of the orchestra in the year 2020.
I run the San Diego Youth Symphony, and so we're working with young musicians, most of whom will not go on to be professional musicians, and a very small percentage who do go on to conservatory and choose to pursue music as a career. And I think that's an important distinction because, as we heard from Aaron, the majority of orchestras in America are not professional orchestras. So, to my mind, the future of the orchestra is in getting more people playing. That does not mean more professional musicians. And the more people play, the more their families will attend, the more the orchestra, in whatever form it's structured, will have relationships in their community and serve the community. It'll become a place where the community comes together. And we know that that happens in some of the largest orchestra settings, like the LA Philharmonic is amazing at bringing its community together. And I think it's a practice that all of orchestras need to learn how to do much more substantially so that their experience of an orchestra concert extends not just to the experience of the music, but it becomes a part of the community's interaction and understanding of itself.
I went to I saw on a YouTube link a performance of the Simon Bolivar Orchestra at the BBC Proms. And in that moment, I think the future of orchestras, not just in America, but throughout the world, became very clear to me. Because in 2020, orchestras are not going to play any better than they do now. I mean, the artistic level of orchestras is at a level that's unprecedented. And if anything, the major orchestras, the Chicago symphonies, they've always been great. And all of the mid-level orchestras just keep getting better and better. So what can possibly change just an actual concert experience? And watching the Simon Bolivar Orchestra, they're from Venezuela, which I agree with Simon Rattle, it's the most exciting place for classical music and certainly orchestral music in the world today. Because they don't have the same kind of inhibitions that we have on stage. They don't see themselves as anonymous human beings all wearing exactly the same thing. And so when they all ripped off their uniform, revealing the colors of Venezuela, and during Mambo, and during Huapango, started spinning their instruments in the air when they weren't playing, I thought, this is it. These kids get it. Now, it's not going to happen anytime soon in American orchestras. We begin with baby steps. But I can promise you that kind of really being in touch with the audience in a way that goes beyond great playing is definitely in our future.
I think the best hope for rebuilding a healthy musical organization in each community is to establish a vibrant music program in our schools. So ideally, I think in a perfect world, I think every elementary school needs to start with this vibrant music. We need to have instruments. When I was young, there was instruments in the school. There are no more instruments. If the parents can't afford them, those children have to maybe go in the chorus. We have to get them involved. It's not that they're all going to be in music, but it's that they're going to all become music lovers.
To me, the orchestra of the future is going to have to matter to people who never come to its concerts. It's going to have to matter in the community, in not just as an ensemble of 70 or 80 or 100 musicians on the stage, but as musician citizens and as an institutional citizen of the community. And you said something actually triggered one example, a concrete example, which to me is almost ideal. The Walla Walla Symphony in Washington, a city of 25,000, with kind of two economic tiers. There's an upper middle class and wealthier segment, and then there's a lot of poverty around it. And they heard from music teachers who wanted to get music back in the schools exactly what you said: we don't have instruments. And they said, well, we can help that. And they communicated to everybody in their entire mailing list, donors, board members, volunteers, musicians, staff, do you have an instrument lying around in your closet that you don't use anymore? Contribute it to us, we'll give it to a child. And they give it to the child for a year. At the end of the year, the child shows that they've used it, shows that it's in good condition, and they get it back again. And they will keep it through high school. The program's only 3 or 4 years old, so they haven't figured out what they're going to do at the end of high school, whether they'll give it to the child or start again. They collected 250 instruments. Now, 250, I think, is 1% of 25,000. So it's 1% of the population of the city, that many instruments that went out to kids. There's an orchestra that figured out a way to matter to a community without playing a note in that program, but using its resources. And to me, that's what we have to start seeing more and more of, orchestras really connecting in every conceivable way as community resources.
There is an envisioned future, what we would like to see happen, and then there's also something that we think probably will happen given the momentum. And the issues include these 4. The impact of electronic media on artistic and administrative functions, how the music is delivered, how we interact with our donor base and others. Second is the issue of sustainable financial models, the so-called structural deficits of the Flanagan Report and others, and what people say is the supply. I mentioned 34,000 concerts, which is wonderful, 29 million attendees. But there's a question is whether the supply is outstripping the demand, or at least the supply and how it's delivered is outstripping the demand. Third, it's been touched on, is community relevance and its effect on policy. An example that brings that home is that in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota recently levied a tax on orchestra concert tickets. As a nonprofit entity, that's news, and speaks to where the mindset is going in terms of the community's value of music. And fourth, a question out in the field is the maximizing the value of the most important capital that orchestras has, which are the musicians, in terms of number and skill level and what have you. How can we maximize the value they can add to their organizations in addition to being on stage? I'm curious to ask any member of the panel to jump in on which of those things in the next 10 years do you think will really, or something else, will really have the biggest impact on what we'll perceive to be the biggest change in orchestras?
Quite often in the orchestra world, we're actually very far behind the times in terms of technology and financial models. And so the things that evolve end up being reactionary or being sort of in the tail of other sectors of our entertainment life that have found or invested in technology. So I think that orchestras, the thinking that goes on in orchestras isn't always the most forward-looking, and that's sort of a symptomatic result.
Well, I'm going to pick up on that thread, actually, because obviously the Metropolitan Opera has the advantage of being a highly visual art form, stage and so forth. In the orchestra world, there has been, unfortunately, in my mind, a tendency to always do things the way we've always done things. And if you go to most orchestra concerts, they look precisely like a concert looked to Brahms. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they look pretty much, except the orchestra's bigger, like concerts in the 1400s of the Royal Danish Orchestra may have looked. The repertoire's different, but the fact is, I'm 68 years old, and I remember our first television set, and I was a kid. And in those days, the family actually went in as a family, turned on the set to watch a specific program, and turned it off. It was kind of like going out to the theater, but not going out. It's a generation or two after me where people grew up with television on 4, 5, 6 hours a day, children. That rewired people. And our field, of all the fields, our field hasn't recognized that. We have a visually static art form that is actually also, by the way, a black and white art form in terms of the costumes we wear. And I don't, for a minute, suggest that the answer is add flashing laser lights to concerts. But it would be really interesting for the field to start thinking about how do you add something that enhances the musical experience. Even something simple like, what about different colored lights for different pieces of music. A musically sensitive lighting designer who says, you know, that piece or that movement is orange. And I don't want to start seeing it like change distracting, but some visual element. And very quickly, the last thing I saw, an organ concerto played in a small orchestra in Indiana. And it's the small orchestras, by the way, that tend to have the courage to experiment. The big ones are terrified to change anything from their 200-year-old tradition. They had an organ concerto in the first half of a concert. They had a screen behind the orchestra and a camera, a fixed camera, so it wasn't distracting with angle changes. And the whole audience saw the organist and saw not only the organist's hands, but the organist's pedal work. And that's all people could talk about at intermission was, I had no idea that the footwork that goes into playing an organ concerto. It was a brilliant use of technology. It enhanced, not distracted from the concert experience. And I think more and more of that kind of thinking is going to go into orchestras.
And here I am now, a conductor. I'm going to speak to you on financial models. But I think that all of these things that we are discussing, actually, they're all concentric circles. Everything interacts. And you know, it's fascinating to me how often I hear the story of when you take a cab at the Cleveland airport and you come into town and you ask that cabbie what to do and what are the things to do. Frequently that cabbie says, well, you know, we got the best orchestra in the world, right? And you know that this taxi driver has probably never been to a Cleveland Orchestra concert. Now, why would he say that? And if he says that, that probably speaks to a model that's so inclusive and so, you know, it's not just reaching out, but reaching in, and so that people would necessarily want to participate in all the activities of that orchestra, including giving generously to the ensemble, so that, you know, we keep hearing when we go into, you know, Cleveland, yeah, you got to come hear this orchestra. So I think if each town creates that kind of pride, and certainly that would have to be the case in Walla Walla, you know, even though these people probably are not coming to concerts, it would certainly, you know, engender and actually want them to give money to that organization.
If you can join me in a round of applause for each member of our panel. David Cizak, Dalu, Edward, Janet, Henry. I think you guys did good. That was great.